In movies, it often seems hackers do random things, like they always show a password screen, a password login, where they're just typing the password. But actually, it's not how it works. Hackers follow a certain process, the hacker methodology. So this is what any hacker will do. So regardless whether it's a professional hacker or a criminal, all of them follow the same kind of steps for hacking a system. So the first step that they'll do, let me just enlarge the font here. The first step that they'll do is reconnaissance. So the first step they'll do is reconnaissance. The reconnaissance step is all about collecting information about your target. You want to know who is your target, what software or systems is he running. Get a general picture of your target. The next step that you'll do is enumeration and scanning. So enumeration, scanning. What the hacker will want to know is like which software is running and what version of the software is running and such kind of information. So for example, it might be running a web server, and perhaps a network file server. Any system can install different software, or any company, and you want to know which is running, and then when you know which versions of the software is running or which services are available, then you can start to more specifically target the system. So the next step is gaining access. By gaining access to the system, you might do different techniques. For example, a malicious program, a malicious USB disk. It can be that is exploiting old software. The basic idea is to gain access. And what usually happens is that you gain access into the system, but this is not administrator level access. This is just user level access, like employee level access into the system. So next, they'll do a step called privilege escalation. So with the privilege escalation, what they'll do is to try and gain more access into the system. Now this can be horizontal escalation or vertical escalation. So the difference is like you can try to gain access as different employees into the system or different users of the system, or you can try to get a higher level access into the system, which is the administrator user, or on Linux called the root user. So a root user or the administrator has total control over the computer. So the basic idea is to gain more access into a system. The next step might be covering your tracks. So professional hackers won't need to do that. In most of the scenarios, like hiding your tracks that you have access into the system and that you hack them. And finally, you might want to create a certain report of the outcome and all the information so that it can be easily reproduced. So these are the steps of the hacker methodology. In the next videos, we'll get into more details on these steps. So these are the steps that any hacker will use to hack any system. So the first step is reconnaissance. What you'll want to do is collect information about your target. So that doesn't involve directly interaction with the target company or the target systems, but try to find on the internet information about your targets. So it's a pretty simple idea, and you look for tools on the internet to gather information about systems or people. So for example, we can open Firefox, and let's say our target is some famous company, for example SpaceX. So let's say we want to know about SpaceX. Where do we find information about SpaceX, right? We just type google.com and search for SpaceX. So then you'll find websites related to SpaceX, for example spacex.com. There's Wikipedia on SpaceX. They have a Twitter account, so you'll see that they have internet presence in different websites. So the idea is to collect as much information as possible, all the links, to know all the possible ways to attack the target. So Google is one of the websites. You might have Wikipedia. If you're looking for a person, you can search for peoplefinder.com, which is US-based, but you can find people. There's the Whois service. So if you go to who.is, you can find information about any domain. For example, the website was www.spacex.com. You'll find the company where they are registered, when the website expires, when it's last updated, or when it will be updated. And also you can usually find like other information here, like about their mail services, the IP address of the website, and general different information. So that's the Whois website. Now you can use hunter.io. So hunter.io lets you find email addresses of anyone. For example, let's say hypothetically our target is spacex.com. Find email addresses. If you have an account, you'll see email addresses of the company. You can use buildwith.com to find or technology that the website is built with. So hunter.io will find you all the email addresses of the company. If I go to buildwith.com, you can find information with how the website is built. So you'll see they're using Google Analytics and general stuff, right? So the idea is to collect as much information on the target as possible. You can also use a tool called GoBuster or so sublister. And this allows you to scan for directories on any website or subdomains. GoBuster is another tool for that. So you can type, let me enlarge the font. You could use GoBuster to scan the system for directories. So for example, it would go with a dictionary and then SpaceX/ words. So basically using a dictionary to find any directory and subdomains on the website. So the basic idea of reconnaissance is to collect information about your target. And most of the cases that means that no interaction with the target or systems at all, but instead using the internet to find information about it using the websites I showed you. And for example, there is spacex.com, but you'll see they also have a Twitter account, for example, and a YouTube account. And so the idea is that you find as much information as possible in this step. The second step is enumeration, scanning and enumeration. So this is actually where the hacker will interact with the machines. So there can be one or more machines that the hacker discovers that can be attacked. So that can be, for example, a server, so a computer running publicly faced to the internet. Now any website runs on a server, for example. Let me enlarge the font here. So any website runs on a server, or any computer on the internet has an IP address. You can find an IP address using the ping command. For example, ping with a website. Let's say Google.com. You'll see they have an IP address, which is the 4-digit number. Now, if you're on the same network, you will also have IP addresses. For example, if I type the command IP address show, it shows you the IP address of this computer. So what you can do if you have the IP address of one or more computers is to scan them. Now typically scanning is done using tools like Nmap, and the idea of this scanning is to see or to determine in which ways can the systems be attacked. So to simplify, when you make a scan, it checks what is running on that computer. Is it running a web server? Is it running a secure shell, so remotely control the computer? Is it running a remote desktop server? is it running a network file sharing? And our service might be running on the computer. So the idea is to discover in which ways can the system be attacked. Now, one of the most important tools for that is called Nmap. So Nmap is a tool that lets you scan a target and tells you what ports are open. So if you don't know what ports are, every application running on a computer exposed to the network has a port. So you can think of ports like doors into the system. For example, there can be web server running, then they have the web port open. There can be a network file sharing program running, then a network file sharing port open. Might be a remote desktop service, then they have the remote desktop service port open. So it sounds more complicated than it is. Let me just do a quick demonstration. So we'll do a scan. We'll do Nmap with IP address. This is a server running on my network. And I'm going to press enter. And you'll see it does a scan. And you'll see it runs two services. You see port here, state, and service. So every service has a port. You'll see SSH service here has port 22. HTTP service has port 80. You might have heard of HTTP service before, because when you open the internet and you open any web page on the internet, you'll see it's, so let's say we open google.com. You'll see it has HTTP in front. So HTTP is a web service. Now SSH is a remote is a remote shell service. So web service we are familiar with. So that means that we can just copy this IP address and type it in the browser because it's a web service, right? So we type http:// and you'll see, okay, they have a website running with the Apache 2 default page. So we might be able to attack this computer using the web pages running on the server, using the web service. You'll also see there's an SSH service running, and the idea of the SSH service is to remotely control a computer using the terminal interface. So SSH you can connect using the command SSH username at the IP address. Now in this case I know the username, the IP address. Yes, then they would ask your password, and you are now inside the computer and can control that computer. Okay, let me quit that. So Nmap tells you which services are open on a computer. So this works for any system on the network, and it doesn't just have to be a server, because sometimes desktop computers also open ports. For example, if they want to share a directory in Windows, there's like sharing directories. Or they might open a remote desktop for the Windows computer. So ports can be open on any computer. If a port is open, that means that you can connect to it, and possibly could then try to perhaps brute force, so try passwords to gain access, or other types of attacks. So the scanning phase lets you discover which services are running on the computer. Now, because it's running a web service, we can also try to find hidden directories or do so-called enumeration. So if we go to the to any website, for example, www.example.com, they might have all kind of directories on that website, right? It's never just a website. Maybe there is /admin or /secret or /login. So there can be all kind of directories that exist in the website. So you can do enumeration, which scans a website for hidden directories and any directories in general. And you can do that with, for example, GoBuster. So it's a tool on Kali Linux. It's called GoBuster. We type there, so we're going to scan for directories on the website. Mine is U, in this case the IP address. And it scans using a word list. So on Kali Linux there's different word lists in user share word lists. And let me show you that directory. So I'm gonna open user share word lists and use the dir.b directory. Or let me just take the dirbuster directory. You'll see different word lists, and those word lists are used because it's trying the URL and then any word in that word list. So let me open the small one, maybe it won't crash the computer. Okay, so it's will try /index, /images, /download, /2006, /news, /crack, /full, and so on. It will just go down this list of hundreds of words and try to find if that exists on the website or not. So the idea is, of course, to find hidden login pages or documents that should not be exposed, in order that we increase the attack surface so that we know, okay, maybe there is a login page and then you can attack that. Or maybe there are some hidden documents on the server that you can use to gain access to the computer. So we'll do a scan with Deerbuster, and I'll use the small list like this. So this command will enumerate all the directories and that might exist in that word list, right? So this will launch a scan on this website to find hidden directories. I'm gonna press enter. Okay, it needs to be installed. So it will install in a moment, and then it will start scanning the website and try all of those directories, all of those words in the web server, and show you which exists. So you'll see we immediately found some hidden directories. For example, we found /documents, so maybe there is some documents that we can use or find information that should not be exposed. There's an admin page that might be interesting. Maybe we can use that to gain access into the computer. There's a secret page, so that maybe is very interesting. So this is the enumeration phase where you try to get more information. So for example, you can use GoBuster, Deerbuster, or DeerB to find hidden directories. You might try to find out vulnerabilities in the server software itself. So if we go to the browser and we type the IP address of the computer, in this case it's exposing the web, and also press Ctrl-Shift-I and go to network. You can type the IP address, press enter. Then if we click on the first request, scroll down, you'll see it's running Ubuntu on this computer, so we might try to look for vulnerabilities in Ubuntu, and also the software, so in this case Apache 2.4.41, and we might try to attack that. For example, we might be able to find an exploit on ExploitDB and try to attack it that way. However, in this phase, no attacks are actually lost. So the scanning and enumeration phase, the idea is to get as much information as possible on the systems in order to then launch different attacks. So in this case, we have, when you did the Nmap scan, you'll see it's running two services. So we can either attack it using the SSH service, or we can attack it using the web service. So depending on the results of Nmap, you can launch different attacks. Like that is the main idea of the attack and enumeration phase, to gain as much information about these systems as possible. So if it's a company, it will have like many more than one IP address, right? So this is just one, and then you would store all of that information. For example, we would store this. So company A, you will store this information and then scan your next systems and try to find as much possible ways into the system as possible. So for this system, there is web and SSH. If you scan your next computer, other computer, then it might show different information. So with all the IP addresses you discover, all of the IP addresses, then you scan those. Now, if you're on the same network, you can also do ARP-A, and that will show you other computers on the network. So that's if you're in a public Wi-Fi. You could find out more computers in the network and get those. So this is the scanning and phase. The next step in the phases is exploitation. So this is the step that is always shown in movies and is often known as the fullest step, where you gain access into the system. But of course you cannot do that without doing the previous two steps first. And so this is often known as the hack or the vulnerability, but it's just a phase of the hacking process. And in order to do that, you need to do the previous step of reconnaissance and enumeration and scanning first. So the way the exploitation works will depend completely on the computer's configuration. For example, if it's running network file sharing service, so it's sharing directories as is often found in Windows, the hacker could exploit that. If it's running file server, it could be that that is attacked. And maybe even there is no network access, but there's a lot of USB disks being used, and the hacker could use a bad USB to gain access into the system. So the exploitation completely depends on the attack surface and which vulnerabilities or attacked, in which ways the systems can be attacked. So of course, if it's running a web server, then the hacker might try to hack the web server. If it's running a file server, the hacker might try to attack that. If it's running multiple services, then of course the hacker has more possibilities to hack those. So this is called the exploitation phase, and the reconnaissance and enumeration and scanning phase are first. So let's say we want to attack this server, so there's an SSH server running on this computer. First, we will do reconnaissance. So, okay, what we know about this company is it only has one server. Then we have some basic information collected. Next, you want to do enumeration and scanning. So, for example, we need to know the server's IP address. And we could do some scanning. For example, we can run GoBuster. Or first we should know which services are running on this server. So first we'll do a scan. So enlarge this. We'll do a scan. So it's running an SSH server, and it's running a web server, HTTP, on port 22 and port 80. So those are the two ways we can attack this computer. Next, because it's running a web server, we might just open the IP address in the computer. Paste and go, and you'll see, okay, this is a basic server. It's running Apache 2 on Ubuntu, so this gave us some basic information. You could do a scan, for example, with GoBuster. And we're going to use a word list. Let's say a small list, and then you can scan for directories. So now we are still in the scanning phase. We are trying to gain more information on the target system. And the installation is rather slow. Okay, now that it's installed, we can store that, and we want to keep actually notes of our scan. So everything we discover, we want to save that. So we want to save which ways we can attack the system, which in this case is SSH and HTTP. Next, we know that it's running HTTP or a web server, so we can scan for hidden directories. Let's say with GoBuster, and we press enter, and you'll see this command starts scanning the server, and it will do / with all of the words listed in this file. And you'll see it found a hidden directory / notes. So you want to save this result as well. So the scanning phase is now complete. We know that we can attack using SSH and web, and that we found a hidden directory called notes. So we can now try an attack. So for example, we could attack with a web server or SSH, as I mentioned. So let's take a look at the web server. So I'm gonna open it, and the hidden directory was /notes. And you'll see it seems to be some note application, and so there's some buttons here that you can click to open notes. So far so good. You can open different notes. So how can we attack this? Well, in this app, you might be able to use call file injection. So what we can do here is, you see here it's opening the file name. So when I click on it, the file name changes. Now what we can try to do is, instead of using this website itself, try to manipulate the parameter and try, for example, to open index.php, and you'll see that open the code of this file. We might try to open different files. For example, it might be in the, usually any website is in the var www directory, any file. So let's try to open etc/issue. So // moves up one directory, and let's try to do that. And you'll see, okay, we were able to open the etc issue file, which contains the operating system. We might be able to open the etc password file. And yes, we can. So now we know the users on the system. So you can see here that, for example, we have a Ubuntu user with the home directory /home Ubuntu. And this way, so with this exploit, we were able to use the called LFI, local file inclusion. We can include files that we're not supposed to include by typing // several times and then trying to open the file that we want. So in this case, we know that there's a root user on the system and a Ubuntu user. Now we might be able to open etc shadow if we have luck, but it's very unlikely. So you'll see that one didn't work. But we can open different files in the computer system to gain information. For example, with the password file, we know now that there is a user called Ubuntu. So now all we need is the password. So that's, and we can also browse around in the file system, right? We can open any file in the directory. Now I have a Linux system here, so let's see in the etc directory. Maybe there are some files that you could be interested in, like cron tab, which is like tasks that are run repeatedly. So you'll see this system isn't running any cron jobs. There's a group directory, host name, hosts. You can open now any config file on the system or other files in the system. So it's pretty bad in itself, but it doesn't give us yet access into the system. So okay, in this method we found the username, which we can then use to attack. We have all the usernames on the system. So we know that web is not the only way we can attack. We can also attack with SSH. So in order to attack with SSH, that can work if it's using password authentication. So if we try to connect with the username that we found before, you'll see it. In this case, it asks for a password. So we can now try to brute force that password using a password list. So I'm using Hydra, which is a brute force password cracking tool. It will try every password in the password list. And we need to extract the password list. So hold on. I'm gonna go to the directory user share word lists and copy the password list to my home directory. Now extract it. You see I have a large password file. proc.txt and then the server address. So now, because we know the username, we only need to correct the password. And you'll see we cracked the password. So now we have SSH access into the system. So this was the exploitation phase. We can now log into the system. And we hacked the computer. So now we have access to this Ubuntu server. So that was all it took. Now, it can be also that it's not running a web server and you don't know the username, but the server is running SSH. In this case, you can also use a username list. So if it's only running an SSH server or you don't know the username, you can still use Hydra, but instead specify, instead of a lowercase l, specify a capital L with your username list. Now, username lists are not installed by default on Kali Linux, but it's easy to install that. So you type sudo apt update. That will update the system. And after that, type sudo apt install sec lists, and that will install all kinds of security lists, like a list of usernames. For example, after running this command, it will install those lists in a directory called user share sec lists. And you'll see it includes lists of passwords, so different password lists, and also username lists, which is then what we're looking for. And we could then say try with user share sec lists, and let's say the search default. It might contain the usernames search default. So now it will try cracking with both the username and the password. So with a list of usernames in that file. So obviously that can take a long time if there's many, because it will have to try both usernames and passwords, so it's going to take a lot longer, and it might be that the username is not in a list. However, then you can try different username lists. For example, try another list and run it, and it will start cracking with, because we use capital L, it will use the usernames in that list. If you use lowercase l, it uses the specific username, capital P for your password list, and then your SSH server. So this cracks both the usernames and passwords using that list, but note that the process will be a lot longer if you don't know the username. So if you can find the username in some way, as we did before, when we did the web app attack using the web application, it can save a lot of time to getting access into the system. Now, in this case, the server was running HTTP server or web server, but that's not always the case, right? So it can be totally different, and it might be that it's not even running a server. So how you exploit really depends on the computer configuration. For example, if it's a desktop application, you're much more likely to send a malicious program that connects to your computer, giving you access into the system. Because if there's no server, of course, you cannot do these type of attacks, but the victim or the person on the desktop computer might install a malicious application that gives you access to his or her computer. It might be that there's not running SSH server or HTTP server, but maybe it's running remote desktop server, or maybe it's running a database server. So, and all that kind of information you discover in the enumeration and scanning phase. And after that phase is the exploitation phase, where you use or try to attack those things you discovered. The next step is privilege escalation. So what is this? We already have basic access into the computer, and what you want to do next is to become administrator in the system, or root. So this step is called privilege escalation. It comes after exploitation, where you already have basic access, user level access into the system, but you want to become administrator. So on Windows, the administrator users are administrator and system. On Linux, the administrator user is called root, ROOT. That lets you completely control the computer. So in this phase, you try to gain access into higher level access into the system to become the root or administrator user. So on Linux systems, it's ROOT. On Windows system, it's administrator or systems. In both systems, there's privilege escalation. However, it just uses different techniques to do that. So any hacker, of course, when they gain access, usually they are system level access, as we were. So when we hack the SSH server, we have username Ubuntu, which is not an administrator user, it's not ROOT. It's a Linux system, so we know that root is the administrator. And we know the password for that user, but we don't know for administrator. So how can you do privilege escalation? Well, it comes in many forms and many ways. So for example, maybe the administrator is very lazy and he uses the same password everywhere. So maybe for the root user, he uses the same password. It can be he's running old software, in which case there's vulnerabilities that can be exploited. It can be that he's sharing SSH keys for the computer, which you can just use. It can be files are configured that shouldn't be readable, for example the password file or the shadow file containing the actual password. It can be in certain programs that can be run as administrator without passwords. So there's different ways to do privilege escalation. I have a course on that, Linux privilege escalation, which goes specifically for Linux techniques that you can use to gain access as administrator, or in this case root for Linux systems. So let's try that. We're gonna log into the server. We already know the password from the previous phase of the exploitation phase, and now we'll do privilege escalation. So we log in, and the first thing we'll see is it's running Ubuntu 14. So that's a rather old version of Ubuntu. If you go to ubuntu.com, or if your server is running something else, you can find the version number and see just how recent is that version. So, okay, the first thing we want to check is just if the system administrator is lazy. And to run anything as root, you type sudo with a command. So sudo, for example, we want to start the bash shell. And you'll see, okay, in this case there wasn't even a password. So we did privilege escalation. We didn't have to do anything except run the sudo command. So this is a badly configured server. Now, okay, let's say there actually was a password for the root user. And we know that if you type uname -a, you know your system version. So in this case, it's running a Linux system. You can also show etc issue. etc issue shows which Linux system you're using. So Ubuntu 14. Old versions of Linux had a vulnerability in the software in that the sudo command was actually abusable. They had a bug in the sudo command that let you instantly become root. So if you type sudo -- version, you'll see 1.8.9 in this version, and older versions and also some newer versions. I think it's lower than 1.8.21. There was a bug in the sudo program which lets you become root immediately. So notice that you have the -u parameter that let you specify which user you want to run as. So in old sudo versions, you could type sudo -u and then -1. So normally 0 would be the root user, 1 would be another user, 2 would be another user, and so on. So if I show you etc password, you'll see every user has a unique ID, and you can then use the sudo command with that ID. I mean, that is the normal use. Sorry, -u with, for example, 999 for the Ubuntu user. But this has a bug in that you could specify -1, and that would instantly make you root. So we can open bin bash, and we are root. So that's a vulnerability in old versions of sudo that lets you become instantly root. So it could be that the system administrator hasn't updated the software, and there is some vulnerability that lets you become root easily. There can be other vulnerabilities. For example, maybe we are able to read the etc shadow file, which contains the passwords. Okay, in this case we aren't, but that could be a vulnerability where you can read that file and get the password that way. It can be that there's SSH keys on the system. So in this case there aren't any SSH keys. But there's different ways in which privilege escalation is possible. And the main idea of this step is to become root into the system. And how that is done really depends on the system configuration. So for example, on this system is a really old version of Linux. So that allows us with this exploit to become root, and also we could just type sudo because the root didn't even have a password. Now it can be also that the system administrator is lazy and using the same password. You could also try a brute force attack with Hydra to try and brute force the root password. There's many different techniques, and of course they differ also depending on the system. So if you hacked a Windows system, then there's different privilege escalation techniques for that system. So on Linux, these are some of the techniques that are used. There are more techniques, and this is like one of the last steps of the hacking, where you become administrator into the system.